So the first, these sessions don't have any titles or topics, but this is clearly the developments, most recent developments in macroeconomics. And the first speaker is Mark Gertler. 15 minutes for discussion and 15 minutes for general discussion.
Okay, thanks a lot for inviting me. I think we can all agree that go back to the eve of the crisis, 2007, and think about the conventional DSGE models that were being widely used by central banks. I think we can all agree that these models really weren't up to the task of accounting for what would happen in the years that followed. So, given that, John asked me to talk a bit about what has happened since. How have DSGE models been updated in light of the events of the crisis? And so what I thought I'd do is talk about a very concrete example, and that is incorporating quantitative easing. Quantitative easing was one of the policy measures that banks on both sides of the globe took to fight the crisis. And I picked this example partly because it allowed me to illustrate some of the developments in DSGE models and incorporating financial factors. And then also I think it illustrates the usefulness of really getting into the micro foundations. And by doing so, I think you get insights in how QE might work. Now, just a brief digression on philosophy. I take the view that no single model or modeling approach is useful for all purposes. And accordingly, I think the preferred approach is to use a suite of models, the kind of thing the Bank of England does. I'm not just saying that because there's Bank of England people here. I say that with the New York Fed too. Anyhow, so where do DSGE models fit in? They occupy a middle ground between more statistical and theoretical models. And the logic of the DSGE approach is you like a model that's credible in terms of statistical fit and forecasting, but there's enough economic structure so that you can give some economic interpretation to the forecasts, and you can also do policy evaluation or conditional forecasting, conditional on changes in the policy rule. And finding exactly this middle ground is going to involves art as well as science, because any DSGE that can credibly fit the data, given the constraints of tractability, is going to involve some ad hocery in the model. And if it's done well, or the way you would like to do it, I should say, is to do it in a way in which the ad hocery really doesn't interfere with what you want to do. It's reasonable to hold this stuff constant in the exercises you're doing. And this is going to involve judgment, of course, and that's why I say DSGE modeling is art as well as science. Related point is no single DSGE is useful for all purposes. Again, part of the spirit of the DSGE approach is you want something that's tractable. There's a bunch of major, maybe 8 to 10 macroeconomic series that you'd like to explain. So you'd like a fairly parsimonious representation that allows you the ability to interpret. So, for example, if you take the DSGE model on the eve of the crisis, the conventional model, that model was really designed to account for what happened in the 70s, explain the simultaneous high inflation and unemployment. And I think that model did a pretty good job of that, and also giving us insights on how to deal with simultaneous high inflation unemployment. And for that purpose, it was reasonable to abstract from the financial structure. Obviously, if you want to understand what's going on in the last couple of years, you can't do that. Now, along these lines, there's been a lot of criticism of DSGE models. My view is this was more a failure of imagination than a failure of methodology. I think many in the profession, or most in the profession, fail to see the risks that have been building up through the shadow banking system. This is not just true of the profession, it was true across the board, the credit rating agencies, traders, and so on. failure to recognize this, the vulnerability of the system. But in fact, the tools existed to incorporate financial factors in these models. And just speaking from experience, I wrote a model with Bernanke and Simon Gilchrist 15 years ago, DSGE model with financial market frictions. I can say when we did it, Ben had no idea he was actually going to have to make use of something like that later, but nonetheless, it had been done. And because financial issues weren't at the forefront of macro, this kind of stuff fell on the wayside. That's changed, and now the literature is rapidly adjusting. Okay, now the example of before the crisis, the policy instrument the Federal Reserve used, and most industrialized central banks used, was a short-term interest rate. After the crisis started, a whole variety of new policy tools were introduced. This was at first a response to the disruption of financial markets. The idea was to get credit flowing again behind these various policies. And then in February 2009, there was a second consideration. The funds rate hit the zero lower bound, so in fact, the conventional instrument was off the table. Now, the most visible of these new tools were, in Fed speak, large-scale asset purchases around the rest of the globe. They're known as QE or quantitative easing. And what QE or LSAPs involved was the central bank purchase of longer maturity assets and funded with short-term interest-bearing overnight bank reserves. And in the US, there's been three main instances. The first and the most dramatic was at the height of the crisis in December 2008. QE1 was announced. And this was a massive purchase in phases of mortgage-backed securities, government debt, and also agency debt, or the debt of government-sponsored agencies, Fannie Mae and Ginnie Mae, that participated in housing markets. October 2010, the recovery had stalled, so there was a second wave, more modest in scope, and focused on government bonds, long-term government bonds. This is QE2. Finally, just this past month, the recovery again is stalled. Now the Fed is committed to a somewhat open-ended purchase of securities, but this time the shift is into mortgages and mortgage-backed securities. Okay, now this is not without controversy, but there is evidence that a fairly large number of authors have looked at it now and find evidence that QE1 and QE2 in fact reduced long-term interest rates and also reduced various credit spreads. Now, it's easiest to see with QE1. QE1 was announced. You actually do see a drop in long-term government bond rates. You do see a noticeable drop in mortgage rates, even greater than the drop in government bond rates. So you can just see it in the time series. And I don't think that's so controversial to suggest QE1 had a fairly significant impact on rates. More debate about QE2, but the weight of the evidence suggests a modest effect of QE2. A $600 billion government bond purchase reduced loan rates about 12 to 15 basis points. Now, one of the reasons QE1 might have mattered more, it was just much larger in scale, 2.5 times QE2. But if you control for that, you still see a bigger effect. You adjust for size, QE1 is about 3 times the size of, in terms of effect on market rates of QE2. And what were the other differences? Well, first of all, QE1 was conducted in a situation with greater illiquidity in markets, and also the types of securities purchased were different. QE1 focused much more on mortgage-backed securities. And in fact, I think the evidence suggesting a greater impact from purchase of mortgage-backed securities is what led the Fed in the most recent round to focus on mortgages as opposed to long-term government bonds. So what I'm going to talk about is a unified framework for analyzing LSAPs or QE, and with this, we'd like to be able to analyze different types of QE. For example, purchases of government bonds versus purchases of mortgages. We'd also like to be able to take a look at the variations on this side of the Atlantic. And the perspective I'm going to take, and I think this comes straight from the microeconomics, is that LSAPs reflect central bank intermediation. That is, like private banks, the central bank funds their assets by issuing short-term debt. This is something a hedge fund can do. And if you think of what the central bank's liabilities are, they're interest-bearing reserves. Okay, they're not money per se. They're stuff that it's an obligation of the government that pays interest, and I think it's most useful to think of it as short-term government debt. And when did this central bank or the Fed accumulate this stuff? They accumulated this stuff when the institutions that normally held it were going under. So we had a collapse of the investment banks, Lehman Brothers, and so on. They were holding mortgage-backed securities, dumped them on the market. The Fed stepped in. I tell my friends at the New York Feds, the only difference between the New York Fed at that point and Goldman Sachs is the traders at the New York Fed weren't getting bonuses. So how does this mean LSAPs are going to work? They're going to depend upon limits to arbitrage on private intermediation. So the central bank has to be able to do something that the private sector can't do. Otherwise, the only impact is to displace central bank intermediation with private sector intermediation with central bank intermediation with no effect on asset prices. And what I'm going to argue is that the advantage the central bank has is that it can obtain funds elastically. Compare the Fed, for example, to Bear Stearns. The Fed can issue short-term these bank reserves to obtain funds, whereas Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and so on, there's just too much risk perceived in the private sector. The other thing you're going to get out of this is that the type of security purchase is going to matter. For example, we'd expect limits to arbitrage to be greater with assets that involve some degree of private sector risk in long-term government bonds. Okay? And the model will admit that this way. Now, the alternative view, or the conventional view, is that imperfectly elastic household demand for long-term securities implies that asset supplies are going to matter. That is, investors just care about a maturity, they don't care so much about returns, so you dump more supply on the market, you're going to have a big adjustment in prices. But what this misses is that it's the behavior of the marginal investor that's key. Okay, you can have people with relatively inelastic demands, but you've got to be able to account for the behavior of arbitrageurs in the market, and limits to arbitrage are going to be key. And here in the U.S., a lot of these securities are held by leveraged financial institutions. That is, they're institutions that have a relatively small amount of capital relative to their assets and finance most of their activities with short-term debt. For example, leveraged financial institutions on the eve of the crisis held more than 40% of agency mortgage-backed securities and about 30% of agency debt and almost 20% of long-term government bonds. So these institutions, you can think of, these include hedge funds and so on. These are the arbitrageurs operating in the market. Okay. The macro model, I'm going to start with the conventional DSGE that was in operation in 2007, and obviously we're going to have to modify that. We've worked with a streamlined version of that. What's going to be different about it is we're going to include banks, and these banks are going to face endogenous financial constraints. And in a crisis, these endogenous financial constraints are going to tighten and restrict the flow of bank credit, and this is going to contribute to the crisis. And this is perhaps the main difference between at least the DSGE I work with now and say the conventional DSGE before the crisis. Then there will also be a central bank. Before, the central bank just worked with conventional interest rate policy, Now the central bank is going to do asset purchases as well as conventional policy. Now, parsimony is the challenge here, because again, we're after trying to explain 8 to 10 critical time series. You can expand the list if you like. So you want to keep things tractable. Once you introduce financial frictions that you need heterogeneity, you need lending and borrowing and so on. How do you do it in a way that's tractable? Well, here's a trick we use. So think of each household as consisting of 1 minus F workers and F bankers. The workers earn wages. The bankers go out and manage financial intermediaries and pay dividends. And think of the household as depositing funds in intermediaries that they don't own. Okay? So we'll have lending, borrowing, and intermediation. We also have the perfect consumption insurance within the family, so this means that we don't have to keep track of the dispersion of consumption. You could have separate agents, but for what we're interested, that's not going to affect the macroeconomic predictions. The other thing in working with these models, you learn if an agent, like a bank, is credit constrained, there's an incentive to accumulate your way or build up the equity position to the point where you're perfectly collateralized. You can self-finance anything. So the way we limit this building up, or another way to think about it, the way we encourage a payout of dividends is with IID probability 1 minus sigma. A banker has to exit. We make the exit probability low. So bankers can have a long expected horizon, but they don't last forever. And this is needed to get them to eventually make payouts. And they're replaced by new bankers who receive a stirrup transfer from the family. This is a very simple way to maintain aggregation, but to have distinct banks and also have dividend payouts. And here's the model in a diagram, at least the part that's different from the standard model. They're going to be banks. Households deposit funds in banks. The bank takes its equity capital and its deposits, and it makes loans. These loans are basically can be thought of as state contingent claims on firms. It can also hold long-term government bonds. The government issues the long-term government bonds. Non-financial firms issue the claims. And the firms, either they're financing their existing capital or they're financing new investment from capital producers. Also, the banks face financial market frictions, and this is going to play out in the amount of deposits they can attract is limited by their equity capital. And the only way they can build equity capital is through retained earnings. So how does a crisis work? Crisis, the bank takes a loss on its assets. That depletes its equity capital, and the amount it depletes its equity capital is going to depend upon the amount that the bank is leveraged. So the more leveraged, the greater the vulnerability of the bank. So loss in equity capital restricts deposits, and what does that do? That forces a fire sale of assets. So asset prices go down. Capital producers have less incentive to invest, and that's the way the crisis is going to work in the model. So this is just basically writing out the algebra. So given time, I'm just going to skip through it. The top is the balance sheet with assets on the left-hand side and liabilities on the right-hand side. This is the accumulation of equity, return on assets, and return on bonds. The banker operates in the interest of the household, so the banker is maximizing expected payouts. And what's the expected payout? That's the equity that the bank is left with when the bank exits. So the top hand line is the expected dividend payouts. And again, this is the accumulation of equity. Now, if you didn't have any financial market frictions, you'd have complete arbitrage. So R is the riskless deposit rate, RB is return on long-term bonds, and RK is return on capital, and lambda is the household's discount rate. So without financial market frictions, there's perfect arbitrage amongst the different rates. With the capital market friction, what can happen the excess return on capital can exceed the discounted cost of deposits. Why doesn't the bank take advantage of the fact that deposits are cheaper relative to the return on capital? It's because of the financial market friction. And this has real effects on the economy because this implies a higher cost of capital and less investment. So what's a crisis in this model? A crisis is a widening of the credit spread. And this corresponds to what we saw in practice because over the crisis, we saw credit spreads widen like crazy. What's also going to happen is the term premium can go up as well, and that will also be symptomatic of the crisis. And where does quantitative easing come in? Quantitative easing is about reducing these credit spreads. The banks are limited by arbitrage, so the central bank comes in and reduces these credit spreads. And actually, Bernanke is the only person in the world who doesn't refer to this policy as either LSAP or QE. He called it credit easing. And in his mind, what this policy does is it improves the flow of credit by reducing credit spreads. And I'll let you in on another secret. In fact, if you look at the behavior of the Federal Reserve Board, every new policy that the Fed put online was in response to a spread widening up in some markets. So the Fed comes in, and most of the time, at least, the spread goes down. The same thing is true worldwide. Okay, so you need a reason for limits to arbitrage. I don't have enough time to go through the details. We need, in the old days, it used to be tough to motivate why there were frictions in the financial markets and agency problems, but then Bernie Madoff came along, MF Global came along, all sorts of other financial institutions came along. And basically what we do is we introduce an agency problem where the bank has incentive to sort of make off with some of the depositors' funds. And we assume that also that it's easier to make off with the funds from a private portfolio than from a long-term government bond portfolio. And the reason we do this is we want the friction to be greater in the private securities market than in the public market. So in the end, what you get is a kind of risk-adjusted capital requirement where NT is the bank's equity capital, Phi-T is an endogenously determined maximum leverage ratio, and the left-hand side is risk-weighted assets, where capital, the amount of loan capital is QT times ST. Long-term government bonds are QT-BT, but delta is a number less than 1, reflecting the fact that the risk weight on long-term government bonds is going to be lower in this model. And also, you get the bank gets to choose between holding capital in long-term government bonds. And what arbitrage suggests is that the expected return or term premium on government bonds should be less than the expected excess return on capital. And why is that the case? Because there's less friction with government bonds. The creditors will let the bank do more leverage if it's financing government bonds than if it's financing loans. So given you can lever a lot more with government bonds, in equilibrium there's got to be a lower expected return to holding long-term government bonds. Okay, given the nature of the model, this stuff aggregates easily. And the reason I'm putting this up is because in the simple DSGE, these are the two equations that are really different from the standard model. The standard model, there's arbitrage between short rates and capital. Here, there's a capital constraint, which says that the amount of bank assets the banks hold has to be less than the amount of equity capital in the banking system, where again, Phi-T is an endogenously determined maximum leverage ratio. This equation is the evolution of net worth. This is a state variable in this model. So these are the two key equations which are different. What's a crisis? A crisis is you get negative return on assets. That affects net worth. That causes fire sale at banks, and that makes the problem worse. That's sort of the adverse feedback loop or financial accelerator, except the difference from what I did with Bernanke is this is applying to banks as opposed to non-financial firms. Where do LSAPs fit in? Well, Okay, the central, private banks may be limited by their capital and the amount of arbitrage they can do. So the central bank can step in and, central bank, oops. Central bank can step in and just let me, I guess a picture will tell the story. So suppose we have the crisis, negative return on assets, the bank takes a loss on its equity, that restricts its deposits, forces a fire sale of assets. Now what the central bank can do is step in, issue short-term debt, in this case this is overnight interest-bearing debt, and purchase these assets and bid up the prices, okay? And what you can show is that purchases since the friction is greater with loans and government bonds, an equal dollar purchase of the private security is going to have more bang for the buck than purchase of the long-term government bond. We can extend the model to have direct holdings of assets by households to capture the data, but you have to have some friction at the margin in households acquiring assets, because if there's no limits to arbitrage in the households holding assets, then you're back to the model where financial factors don't matter and where QE doesn't matter. Okay, the rest of the model, I guess, is standard, so I'm not going to talk about that. Let me just conclude with several policy exercises. I have about 3 minutes left. Okay.
Cool.
Okay, so the first exercise, okay, this is to calibrate the model. We said the evidence from QE2 is that a $600 billion purchase reduced long-term government bonds rates about 1,200 basis points. So in the upper left-handed panel, we phase in purchases of QE2, so like what was done in the data. And also at the time, the expectation was that QE, it takes 6 months to get phased in and last about 2 years before being phased out. It was also expected that the funds rate would relate, the upper right-hand corner would remain at the zero lower bound for about a year. So we do the phase-in. What happens? Okay, there are limits to arbitrage. So what happens is you see that excess returns on government bonds and excess returns on capital go down. And this has the effect of reducing the 10-year government bond rate. And again, we pick parameters so that we hit this target. So we can show the model matches the data. Then what else do you get is the reduction in long-term rates stimulates output, and that leads to an increase in output of about 1%. And that's considered, there's some time series evidence, I forget the names of the authors, it's cited in a background paper, who suggest that this was about the effect, looking at evidence from a variety of countries, that about 1% was a reasonable estimate from a drop of rates about 12 to 18 basis points. The average inflation did go up after QE2. If you look at the average over 5 years, the model hits it. It's sort of off on the short run effects. And the other thing is the red line does a similar purchase of mortgage-backed securities. And you see, in fact, you get a bigger kick with a similar purchase of mortgage-backed securities. And again, this is because the financial market friction is greater with the private security than with the government bond. Okay, do we have time for 2 pictures? Or? Okay. Now, how does this map into conventional policy? We can do the following exercise. We can ask, what's the equivalent interest rate policy that would map this unconventional policy? So we ask the question, okay, instead of doing the unconventional policy, let's reduce the short rate X basis points for a year, and let's find a number where you get the same response as the QE did. And we find that for QE2, this is a reduction in the short rate about 40 basis points per year. So the 12 basis point reduction in long rates from QE2 is equivalent to about a 40 basis point reduction in the short rate per year. And the interesting thing is the response of inflation is similar as well. Both output and inflation is similar. And in a way, it's no surprise because both QE and conventional policy work by affecting market interest rates and the cost of credit. The last slide, we do a crisis simulation. So we consider a shock that reduces asset values suddenly. So what we're trying to get at is imagine these intermediaries learn that the value of mortgage-backed securities is lower. In this kind of model, that will create a crisis because there'll be a drop in the net worth of banks, and it's going to be even greater as the more levered the banks are. That will force them to liquidate, and that will cause excess returns to go up. Then we can go through the exercise saying, how much did QE1 help? So we have a policy that's phased in like QE1. And the bottom line is QE1, this is counterfactual, reduced the drop in output by about 3 to 4, well, by about 3 percentage points. Okay? Given, of course, this is a model dependent, but again, you have to do a counterfactual to figure out the effect of QE. So let me just compute them. Okay, from going through this, you learned LSEPs reflect central bank intermediation. The sort of popular press view is that they're money creation per se, and the big worry from QE is there'd be tons of inflation. And in fact, we haven't seen it. And the key to QE working is limits to arbitrage and private intermediation. Transmission mechanism is very similar to conventional policy. It works through reducing credit costs, therefore you'd expect the output and inflation effects to look similar. What's done on this side of the Atlantic is a bit different, but I think it fits within the same framework. The central bank is stepping in and causing credit to flow in the same way that private financial institutions aren't. So let me conclude by saying that, look, we missed the boat in 2007. We're trying to make up DSGE model. Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mark. Discussion with Simon Renwood.
That's yours. That one's mine. Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you very much for allowing me to comment on this paper. I suspect I'm going to slightly disappoint the organisers because I suspect John may have chosen me to discuss this because I have been quite critical of DSGE modelling in the past, although I've done it myself, do it myself. But actually I really like this paper. When I've been critical, I suppose, I can just pick up one of the things that Mark said right at the beginning. He said that the failure to kind of look at these issues before the financial crisis was a failure of imagination. I think I'd put it a little bit more strongly. I'd say the technique itself encouraged this failure of imagination. But what I've never believed, which some people do seem to believe, was that DSGE modelling, micro-foundation modelling, was incapable of doing this kind of modelling. And it seems to me we have a lot of evidence of that already, that this paper clearly shows it is capable of doing that. And to emphasise this point, I just want to say how policy relevant this paper is. I'll have something to say about theory right at the end. So let me start here with a quote from the Jackson Hole paper by Mike Woodford, which has got a lot of publicity recently. And I think it's fair to say that he's much more pessimistic about the impact of QE than markets. Basically what he's saying in this quote is, if QE isn't signalling a change in the future monetary policy, future setting of short-term interest rates, then he says that the belief that it's going to do something very important is wishful thinking. So that's a very different view from the one taken in this paper. And in a sense I want to push this paper quite far and to say that it's got something very relevant to say about QE in the UK as well. Because QE in the UK has very much focused on buying government bonds. It's much more like QE2 in the US. And the Bank of England has been quite heavily criticised for that. Many people argue that it would be much more effective if QE had been a bit more like QE1 in the US. And so this paper, I think, has a direct bearing on this and could be used, whether Mark wanted to be used, I don't know, but it could be used as a defence of what the Bank of England have been doing. Okay, part of being a good discussant is to kind of summarise what the discussant thinks are the essential points from the paper. So let me do that first and then raise some questions that occurred to me as I go through the results. The key thing, as Mark explained, is banks take deposits in this model and they buy either long-term government debt or they make loans to companies. But they do both, that's crucial. And the agency problem is they may divert some proportion, theta, of these loan funds by, well, this is my language, by paying themselves excessive bonuses and expropriating some of the deposited assets that way. And all the depositors can do in that situation, if that turns out to be the case, is claim the residual value of the bank, which includes the bank equity. And that's going to mean that there's limits on leverage, and so the first equation here is a version of the one that Mark showed. Essentially, with one proviso that I'm going to talk about, the size of the bank's assets are proportional to its equity, which is little m here, where the amount of proportionality depends on theta, this expropriation parameter, and other things. So, I mean, it's a kind of familiar to those who have looked at recent DSGE literature, a kind of residual result. You can do it with collateral and consumers and all kinds of things. The key thing in this paper, though, is that the ability of, or the potential ability of the bank to expropriate assets differs between loans to companies and its holding of government bonds. That it's more difficult to expropriate holdings of government bonds by a fraction delta. And that's going to play a key role. And that's why in this sort of balance sheet equation here, we've got delta multiplying the ownership of government bonds. So there's that important difference in the micro-foundation of this agency problem. But the other key equation here is you're still going to get arbitrage. You're going to arbitrage here across excess returns with this delta parameter featuring. So because there's this bigger agency problem with loans to companies, the excess returns on those loans are higher. But on the other hand, if the central bank is able, the individual bank is able to have a larger balance sheet if it just held government debt. So it's got a trade-off, and so you get this arbitrage relationship. And that arbitrage relationship is going to be crucial in how QE works. So how does QE work? Well, as Mark said, the central bank acts as a bank, but where there's no deposit risk. Or as he rather nicely put it, the people working in the central bank don't get any bonuses. Now, what that means is that if the central bank was as good as a private bank at giving out loans and selecting the right government debt to buy, then I think it would be right to say, from a welfare point of view, we should just nationalise all banks, because we get rid of these excess returns, and that would improve the functioning of the economy, and we get pure arbitrage. Now, to sort of counter that, in the paper, Mark introduces some inefficiency parameters. There are a couple of inefficiency parameters which basically says, no, well, the central bank isn't as good as private banks at making loans or buying government debt. But these kind of parameters appear and then they disappear. I don't think they're actually used anywhere in the paper. I think essentially because they matter either to some kind of fiscal cost of QE, which isn't modelled in this paper, or they matter for welfare, which again isn't explicitly modelled in this paper. But it did raise one question in my mind, which is, unless these inefficiency parameters are particularly large, then presumably there might be some optimal size of QE even in normal times, because you've got a trade-off between reducing the excess returns, which QE does, and lending out inefficiently, which the central bank does. And it's not obvious that trade-off would completely disappear in normal times. And then one slightly wild thought is, well, the government acting as a bank, I guess it can cheat in the sense that it can expropriate the deposits that it holds through inflation or default. That's not something that the paper wants to get into, but I thought it's something I just mentioned. Okay, so the key result then is that central bank asset purchases of any kind will force down long-term interest rates and therefore will stimulate the economy. But purchases of government debt, because of this delta parameter, because agency problems are less for there, will be less effective dollar for dollar than purchases of or making loans to companies. So dollar for dollar, QE in terms of buying government debt will be less effective than QE buying private sector securities. But should this worry a central bank? It's not obvious that dollar for dollar comparisons are relevant because the scale of QE seems to be pretty arbitrary. And indeed, if you pick up this inefficiency point, you could argue that the inefficiency involved in the central bank buying government debt is much, much less than the efficiency in making loans to the private sector. So indeed, it may be optimal for the central bank to just have QE in terms of buying government bonds, as in the case of the UK, it just does more of it. So, in a sense, that's how I think the paper could be used to justify the banking policy. But of course, all of this, of course, does depend, crucially, on that delta parameter, and indeed its invariance of the policy. And it seems to me that that's, in a sense, where the paper, in this particular sense, lives or dies, in how much you believe that's an invariant policy parameter. Just a few quick things to say on the modelling of the crisis. I think it's very interesting that basically the paper can get pretty large effects for QE, even though it's just looking at conventional, what I call Keynesian, normal Keynesian routes of just influencing the long-term interest rates. There's no monetary magic here, there's no signalling of the Woodford kind. In the way it's modelling the crisis, I just had one thought. The way it models the crisis is as a fall in the quality of bank capital, which is fine, but it's a pretty temporary sort of affair. I just wondered whether you thought of modelling the crisis as actually a persistent change in theta. My reason for thinking this is that a lot of people talk about the crisis now as a change, a permanent attitude towards risk. And could it perhaps be that now agents believe that banks actually can rip them off much more than they thought they could before, and that you can maybe model crisis in that way. But the final thing I want to say is that in terms of the theoretical contribution of the paper, I think that the question you have to ask is this the way that DSGE modelling can begin to model financial crisis and a policy response to it? And I would argue that the way that DSGE modelling has advanced is that it's found a sort of parable that's tractable in terms of putting into a model. It's sufficiently vague that you can tell lots of different stories, and different people tell different stories, but they're reasonably happy with those stories, and then you can come up with models that produce interesting answers. So, I think cowboy contracts are a bit like that. Lots of different people tell you different stories about why cowboy contracts kind of work. They're also reasonably happy. New money and utility function would be another. Carroll's work on precautionary savings. He's got a micro-foundations model which is tractable and can deal with that. So that's, it seems to me, the way that DSGE modelling advances. The parameterization, the way it's done, is always for the micro-foundation purists going to seem ad hoc and they'll worry about it, but at least it lets the discipline advance. And I think the interesting question is this the way the discipline is going to advance in terms of modelling financial crisis and policy response? Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot. Do you want to respond, Mark, right away, or will I collect some more questions?
Let me just thank the discussion. I think they're very pretty much agree with what he said. I'm not sure what the compliments are, but criticism. The only thing, to me, one thing missing from the model is the consideration of political economy, and that might get at the issue you raised. Like, the Fed does seem to be concerned about the size of its balance sheet, even beyond what they account for capital losses on its balance sheet. And political economy might be a consideration there. Also, why isn't the Fed doing more of this in normal times? Political economy could probably give you some insights in that as well.
Okay, so let's now go to the questions from the audience. Let's start from there.
Yes, Neil Erickson, I am from the Fed, although I should mention, of course, my views here do not necessarily represent those of other staff members at the Fed or the official policy of the Fed. So a couple of remarks and sort of thoughts about things that might be done with this sort of model. First is just a brief comment about QE1. And you mentioned the difference between effectiveness of QE1 and QE2. And the factors you mentioned are very plausible and may well be an important explanation. What you didn't mention was there was no QE0. QE1 was the first one. And before that, we didn't even conceive of doing that sort of thing. And so that in itself may be an important factor here. With QE2, there already had been a QE1. And so
in terms of markets perceiving all
in
this
terms of
going on?
markets perceiving. And
Informing
is
beliefs.
one issue.
Yeah.
Also, in limits of to arbitrage, you emphasize the importance here of arbitrage across firms, but you've only implicitly mentioned that there's a very important limit to arbitrage over time. And the Fed, as a government institution, a long-lived government institution, can start thinking about the arbitrage over time and relaxing limits that might be present there. The final comment concerns the role of expectations here and the sort of discussion that Simon had as well. The expectation has a single dating on it, E sub t, and that's really defining the information set over which expectations are being taken. And it assumes that the distribution of the stochastic variables doesn't change. But you're proposing that theta changes. Well, that's part of that distribution. Or we might have a whole change in the rate of returns or riskiness. And once that occurs, then you must have another subscript there to deal with the perception of when that distribution occurs. And either you know the distribution in the future, which seems really excessive knowledge, or you don't know it, in which case it's no longer rational.
Well,
And so it'd be a very useful direction to pursue in terms of working out what happens with these models.
yeah, no, agreed. I mean, two comments. One is in an earlier paper, Peter and I illustrated how just a shift in beliefs could kind of trigger a crisis like that. So for some reason you believe that the stream of dividends from this asset is going to be lower. That's going to reduce asset values, and that's going to trigger the crisis in this kind of model. The challenge, I take it more of a profession, is given beliefs really do play a role. You know, how do you motivate these beliefs? A wave of pessimism in our model will do bad things in the economy. So then the thing to step back and think about, how can you sort of model those waves of pessimism in an interesting way? And that leads to the second and related point. I mean, there's nothing sacrosanct. We solve the model using rational expectations, but there's nothing sacrosanct about using rational expectations. You can open it up to imperfect information, dispersed beliefs. I guess that's going to be the next section. And maybe get something interesting, you know, about how news shocks or whatever can trigger what's going on. Because the key thing is to get asset values to move and beliefs to move asset values.
Next.
You didn't show any comparison of data, and I'd just be curious. You did make some remarks at the beginning that, you know, relative terms you get, but I'd just be curious for a kind of summary of, you know, where do you stand with that? How good do you think the models are. What order of magnitude or what level of accuracy are the predictions, and
Sure.
and how much
Yeah.
empirical evidence is there at this point?
Yeah, well, part of the challenge, as you know, is all the interesting action has occurred over a relatively short sample, and as was suggested, there's sort of structural changes over a short sample. I would say several people, actually, you were at the conference at the...
The Marco Del Negro talk, I heard.
Yeah, and the Marco Del Negro talk, and there is some evidence that including a financial variable that's tied to the kind of mechanism here improves the real-time forecast. And again, the spirit of all of this is Parsimony. The standard model, is eight key macro variables. Now you find you enrich the sector and include a credit spread where the credit spread falls out of the model. That in fact helps improve that was the point of the paper, that in fact that does improve forecasting, the credit spread. In fact, we saw several papers that suggested credit spreads improve the information. Here, what we've done with this model is just show that, look, you can reverse engineer things within reason to get the pattern of the crisis. You can get the asset values fall, credit spreads rise, and at the height of the crisis, and produce a downturn. Now, there are other things, like if you want to, I think Simon mentioned this, if you really want to get at the high degree of persistence of the crisis, there's other dimensions you might want to change, like household debt and so on. But in terms of providing, so I think there's evidence on the forecasting, and in terms of providing a qualitative description of the crisis, I think the model can do that. Actually, I said that at the conference in NYU, where I think we need more work is on the lead up to the crisis. What led to the buildup of debt and the subsequent vulnerability. I think we're pretty good at, once the bad news hits, modeling the chain reaction that follows, but sort of stepping back and modeling the buildup. I think there's a lot. That's where I think the work should be done.
Okay, next at the back there.
Can I ask you about Bernie Madoff?
I don't know him personally.
Two questions.
Yeah.
The story about him is that if you prevent him from leveraging too much, then it won't be worth him stealing everything. And essentially, you've got to hold him back.
Madoff.
Yeah. First of all, can I ask why do you take this as the key friction rather than what you did 15 years ago with Bernanke, where the friction was if the bank fails, then it costs money to clean it up.
Okay.
And secondly, if Bernie Madoff's the central story, I'm finding it hard to tell a convincing narrative about Delta. Why should he find it? Why should it be harder to help stop him from stealing the stuff just because he chooses to hold government bonds rather than?
You got lots of interesting questions in my jet lag. All right. The first one, I think the Madoff thing is kind of interesting because the Madoff, the claims weren't stuff he had to meet on demand. So these investors invested with him, and he was basically offering them equity claims, and they were just basically trusting him. It wasn't stuff he sort of had to meet on demand. And so one way out of the agency problem suggests here is you want sort of stuff you meet on demand. Now, the answer, why did we choose this friction as opposed to the one 15 years ago? Not because I literally believe the story, but because it's the simplest and most tractable to deliver the result that the bank is balance sheet constrained. And in terms of the reduced form, it looks very similar. The leverage ratio is going to be increasing in the excess return, and the bank is capital constrained. So the choice was one of parsimony and modeling as opposed to actual real-world description. In fact, I kind of like the old one because it had default and so on. But in terms of putting things in and having a sort of optimal dynamic contract, this was the simplest way to do it now, but I'm certainly open to doing it otherwise.
But how does it deliver delta in plausible?
Oh, that question. No, you're right. Delta, I think Simon said it, delta is really a reduced form parameter. It's a simple way to capture that this friction might be weaker in the government bond market than it is in a market for private securities, and capture the evidence, but it's totally reduced form. I mean, but it may not be a bad way in the short term to capture the differential effects of operations in the two different types of assets. Now, we need more evidence to pin down delta. People's prior is different. Mike Woodford would say delta is 0. So then government bond purchases are 0. Other people feel they're strong. On this issue of, I was talking to Simon before, on this issue of London versus the US, another big difference over here is the government bond market is probably less liquid than it is in London. I'm guessing, again, totally wrong about that. That's also. But short answer to your question, that's a stand-in reduced form parameter.
Okay, let's continue. John next. And close to
behind all this is a rolling foreclosure crisis.
Yeah.
And behind that is a rolling house price fall. The private mortgage-backed security market completely dried up in terms of new loans. It's a drastic change. And the federal home loan banking system really had to step in order to make credit flows happen. But that is really outside the framework of QE, I think. And just wondering, how you'd introduce those kinds of quantity restrictions in model design.
Well, okay. Again, I think the next stage would be disaggregation and having a housing sector and also having a separate household sector. Because, QE lowers long-term rates. So anything that's sensitive to long-term rates is going to be affected. There's going to be certain subsectors, as you're suggested, where they're shut off because of various institutional frictions. So my short answer is one has to extend them longer to get that. What you get out of this is QE can lower long rates, and if you have interest-sensitive, you have sectors that are sensitive to long rates, you can trace out the effects. But I completely agree that one thing that's been going on are these institutional frictions, and that means disaggregating the model and incorporate those frictions. It's something to do.
Okay, Marcus next.
Yeah.
Comment on QE in this country. The first round in 2009 did involve purchases of some commercial bills. At that time, there was a spread of high-yield corporate debt over treasury bills of 3,500 basis points. The capital market really was in deep trouble. And the bank argued that even though it didn't buy many bills, the knowledge that it was in there as a purchaser was really pretty profound.
Yeah.
That probably wouldn't apply to later rounds, and indeed they stopped doing it.
Right.
So that's the first comment. There's a question. Maybe as a result of your string of deltas, do you come up with a sort of Friedman story that you can operate on one margin and it'll feed down through the system? Do you get, because Quantitative more normally assume the central bank buys risky equity, but they didn't. They bought commercial bills or they bought agency debt. But is there a sort of Friedman story about it passing down?
Sure. There is. I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but here, if you buy long-term government bonds, because of arbitrage between long-term government bonds and other assets, it will pass down to these other assets. So there will be that effect.
Okay, Danny and then Sherry.
In most cases, it doesn't seem to matter whether you look at an open or closed economy model, because you get the right concepts in the right direction. But in this situation, there's a lot of international concern about cross-country leakages of large QE programs. The choice that you've made suggests that even by closing off that international leakage, you can get a quantitatively accurate description of the changes from LSAT. So do I take from that these international concerns are overplayed? There's actually no need.
Well, there are papers sort of extending this to the open economy and tracing out the effect. You're right that there's going to be, on the one hand, there's leakage effects, but on the other hand, there's also exchange rate effects. which are positive. And I haven't followed that literature closely, well, other than to say people are thinking about those issues.
Sherry?
I don't think this model captures the wider picture that we need to get about whether additional liquidity has been created in the system. I mean, it's a point, not entirely my own, but Manoj Singh made this point that I met, that in having bought over your government securities, you're then crowding out the source of collateral in the private repo markets, which was the source of, government securities being the source of collateral in the repo market for liquidity. So there is no picture as to whether there's any advantages of net creation of liquidity. The rest of the money becomes bank reserves in the hands of central banks. So that's in the conditions of a liquidity trap not being lent out. So this particular thing of crowding out the private sector of a source, an important source of collateral until you start with this model.
That would be, all I can say is that's something that would be interesting to think about. Your point is, there's an advantage of having a certain level of long-term government bonds in the market because the long-term government bonds are these collateral securities for repo loans. And, the one issue about QE2 was there ever any limit to it? You just keep purchasing government bonds. Well, the floor might be the fact that you might want a certain level of government bonds. So, yeah, I agree with your comment. I think that'd be something interesting to look into. I mean, again, the great challenge here is getting at this stuff and maintaining tractability.
This is more a broader point. You said at the beginning that the past DSGE models were very much focused, in the 70s, about high inflation, high unemployment, and didn't model the current crisis. And now you move to a model that models the current crisis very well. How do you see this as a step forward? Is it too specific right now to just focus on QE?
Well, the models would still have the rudiments of the core models that were, explained in the 60s and 70s. I'll just end with my comment. I mean, I think the models pre-crisis models did pretty well for their purpose. I mean, we had a pretty good period up until 2007. Now we missed it after 2007, but for what they were designed for, they did a pretty good job. Except, we missed this crisis, and that's a big deal, of course.